The signal came from a small blue planet on the edge of a spiral arm that the Galactic Alliance had marked on old star charts as unclaimed, low priority. For 300 years, no one had bothered to send a probe that far out. The system had no valuable minerals, no strange energy readings, and no strategic position near any trade lane. It was just a yellow star, with a handful of rocky worlds and a lot of empty space. Then, one cycle, a listening post on the far side of Velmari space picked up radio waves. Old radio waves, the kind that spread out slowly over decades, carrying music, voices, and strange broadcasts that made no sense to anyone who first heard them. It took years for the signal to be traced back to its source. When it was, the Alliance Science Council sent a full report to the High Assembly, and the High Assembly did something it had not done in a very long time. It called an emergency session. Ambassador Threll Vane of the Velmari Cultural Ministry stood before the assembly floor, her four thin arms folded in the careful way her people used when they wanted to appear calm, even when they were not. She was not a soldier. She was not a scientist. She was a diplomat, chosen for this task because she had a talent for making frightening things sound simple. "The species calls itself human," she said, her translator device turning her clicks and whistles into the common tongue used across 1,000 worlds. "They live on a single planet. Population estimates suggest 9 billion individuals. They have only recently developed interstellar travel, perhaps within the last century. Early scans show cities, agriculture, industry, standard markers of a young, developing civilization." A Korath general near the back of the chamber let out a low, grumbling sound that could have been a laugh. The Korath were an old warrior people, their scales the color of rust, and they rarely spoke unless they had something sharp to say. "Young," General Daskarvel repeated. "Everyone is young until they are not. What do the scans show of their defenses?" Threll hesitated. This was the part of the report she had been dreading. "Minimal," she said, "compared to Alliance standards. A handful of orbital stations, a few dozen warships by our classification. Nothing that concerns the fleet command." "Then why call an emergency session?" Dosker said. "Over 9 billion farmers?" Threll's antennae twitched, a nervous gesture she could not quite control. "Because of the timing," she said. "Their broadcasts. Their history. Something about this species does not add up. We would like permission to send a formal invitation. Bring them into the Alliance gently, observe them, and decide from there what kind of neighbors they will be." The vote passed without much debate. 9 billion primitives, as some called them behind closed doors, were not a threat. They were an opportunity. New markets, new resources, new members, to swell the ranks of a coalition that had grown slow and comfortable after centuries of peace. The Alliance had not fought a real war in almost 200 years. Its newest members were welcomed with parades and trade deals, not fear. So the invitation was sent. It took the diplomatic ship 11 months to reach Sol, the star humans called home. The ship was named the Gentle Current, a name chosen specifically because it was meant to look harmless. It was slow, unarmed except for basic point defense, and covered in soft lighting that the Velmari believed made first contact feel less threatening. Aboard were 7 ambassadors from 7 different member species, a translation team, and Threll Vane herself, chosen to lead the mission because of her steady record and her calm manner. When the Gentle Current dropped out of its long jump and entered the outer edge of the solar system, the crew expected quiet. Most first contact missions began that way. A small probe would drift toward the target world, sending polite signals, waiting patiently for a reply that sometimes took days. Instead, within 6 hours of arrival, 3 ships appeared around them. They came out of what looked like empty space, sensors picking them up only at the last possible moment, as if they had been sitting silently, waiting. They did not fire. They did not send threats. They simply took position around the Gentle Current, one above, one below, one directly ahead, close enough that their hulls filled the viewports. Threll stood on the bridge, gripping the edge of a console with 2 of her 4 hands. "Identify them," she said. The ship's systems struggled. The design was strange, angular where Alliance ships were smooth, built from materials the sensors did not recognize right away. But the size was clear enough, and it was larger than anything the reports had prepared her for. These were not the small patrol craft the scans back home had promised. These were warships, heavy and grim, their hulls scarred in places, as if they had seen real fighting. A voice came through on an open channel a moment later, translated instantly by systems on both sides that had clearly been listening to human broadcasts for a very long time. "This is Earth Defense Vessel Resolute, speaking for Sol System Command. You have entered a restricted approach corridor without prior clearance. State your intentions." Threll's voice came out steadier than she felt. "We are envoys of the Galactic Alliance. We come in peace, on behalf of the Assembly of Member Worlds, to extend an invitation to your species." There was a pause, a long one, long enough that Threll wondered if the humans were consulting someone far away, someone who was not on the ship at all. "Copy that," the voice said finally. "Please transmit your registration and hold position. We will escort you in." The word escort made two of the other ambassadors on the bridge exchange a nervous glance. It was polite. It was also clearly not a request. The three human ships moved with a precision that struck Threll as strange for a species so new to space travel. They did not simply surround the gentle current. They formed a pattern, one that would let them fire on the diplomatic ship from 3 angles at once if it made any sudden move, while leaving themselves clear lines to retreat or reinforce. It was the kind of formation Threll had only seen described in old Alliance training archives, doctrine written centuries ago during conflicts most species alive today had never experienced firsthand. She said nothing about it to the rest of the delegation. Not yet. She wanted to see more first. The escort took 4 days to bring them from the edge of the system to a large station in orbit around the third planet. Along the way, Threll watched through the gentle current sensors as more ships came into view, first a handful, then dozens, spread out in patrols that covered every approach to the inner system. Some patrols passed close to the asteroid belt, others held position near the outer gas giants, far from anything Threll would have expected to need defending. It did not look like a young civilization protecting its home. It looked like an old one still watching for an old enemy. When they finally reached the station, called Gateway by its human crew, the delegation was met not by a general or a soldier, but by a woman in a simple dark suit, her hair streaked with gray, her expression polite but guarded. She introduced herself as Ambassador Maya Illich, representing the newly formed Human Assembly, a government that Threll understood had only existed for a few decades, formed after the old nations of Earth had come together for reasons the records did not fully explain. "Welcome to Sol System," Maya said, extending a hand in the human custom of greeting. Threll had studied enough to know to extend one of her own limbs in return, a gesture that made the humans in the room smile despite themselves. "We've been expecting you, in a manner of speaking. Your broadcasts reached us about 6 years ago. We've had time to prepare a proper welcome." 6 years, Threll repeated, surprised. The Alliance had only decided to make contact recently. Their scouting probes had passed through the outer system quietly, unnoticed, or so the reports claimed. "You detected our approach that long ago?" Maya's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "We detect most things that come near our system, Ambassador. It's something of a habit for us." The tour that followed was carefully arranged, the way any host might show a guest only the rooms they wanted seen. Threll and her fellow ambassadors were shown farms that stretched across continents, cities lit up at night in patterns of gold and white, oceans still blue and full of life, universities, hospitals, art museums filled with paintings and sculptures that Threll found genuinely beautiful, despite having no context for what they meant. It was, by every measure the Alliance used, a healthy, thriving civilization, exactly the kind of member world the Assembly loved to welcome. But every night, when the delegation returned to their guest quarters aboard Gateway Station, Threll found herself standing at the viewport, watching the slow, steady movement of patrol ships in the dark beyond the station's lights. She counted them, more out of habit than any real plan, and each night the number seemed to grow rather than shrink, as if more ships were arriving from somewhere deeper in the system, somewhere the tour had never taken them. On the 5th night, she asked Maya directly, over a quiet dinner meant to be informal, off the record. "Your defenses," Threll said carefully. "They seem extensive, for a species just beginning to explore beyond your own star." Maya set down her cup. For a moment she seemed to be deciding how much to say. "We've had reasons to build them," she said finally, Every civilization has a history, Ambassador Vane. Ours has a chapter most of my people would rather not discuss with strangers. Not yet, anyway. May I ask what chapter that is? Maya looked at her for a long moment, and Threll saw something in the woman's face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Not fear, not quite. Something closer to grief, that had gone on so long it had turned into weight, the kind carried by people who had lost more than they could easily explain. Not tonight, Maya said gently. When your assembly is ready to hear it properly, we'll tell the whole story. For now, let's just say that we didn't build our fleet because we expected the Alliance to be a threat. We built it because we learned, the hard way, that peace only lasts as long as you're ready to defend it. The dinner ended not long after, polite and cordial, but Threll returned to her quarters that night with a knot of unease sitting in her stomach that would not go away. Back on the Alliance homeworld weeks later, when Threll finally transmitted her preliminary report, she chose her words with great care, aware that the wrong phrase might trigger a panic she did not yet have evidence to justify. The human species appears open to Alliance membership, she wrote. Their culture is rich, their people welcoming, their world thriving by every standard measure we use. However, I must note for the Council's attention that their military presence within their home system far exceeds what would be expected of a civilization at their stage of development. I recommend further investigation before formal invitation proceeds to the next stage. The response came back within a day, brief and to the point, signed by 3 members of the High Assembly. Proceed with formal invitation. Concerns noted but do not outweigh benefits of membership. Continue observation. Threll read the message twice, then set it aside and looked out at the stars, thinking of the dark shapes of ships moving silently through the void around a small blue planet, waiting for something the Alliance did not yet understand. She did not know it then, but she was one of the first Alliance citizens to sense the truth that would soon reshape everything the galaxy believed about the quiet, welcoming humans of Sol System. Somewhere in Earth's recent past lay a war the Alliance had never heard of, fought against an enemy no one in known space had a name for. And the ship's humanity kept in constant readiness, the patrols that never stopped, the shipyards Threll had not yet been shown, all of it had been built for one purpose only: to make sure that whatever had once come for Earth would never catch them unprepared again. The formal invitation was extended 3 months later, delivered with full Alliance ceremony, aboard a new flagship sent specifically for the occasion. Ambassador Maya Illich accepted on behalf of the human assembly, with warm words and a careful smile, promising cooperation, friendship, and a bright shared future among the stars. What she did not say, and what the Alliance would not learn for many months more, was that acceptance came with conditions the humans had already decided upon long before the invitation ever arrived. Conditions born from hard lessons, old scars, and a war that had almost erased humanity from existence before it had properly begun. The Alliance believed it was welcoming a young species into its fold. It had no idea it was inviting a veteran of a war still waiting to be finished. Far beyond the edge of Alliance space, in a region of the galaxy no scout ship had charted in over 80 years, something old and patient continued to wait in the dark, exactly the way it had always done, ever since the day humanity had driven it away, and never quite managed to finish the job. It would be a while yet before anyone in the Alliance understood what that meant, but the first signs were already there, hidden in the quiet patrols above a small blue world, if anyone had known to look closely enough. Threll Vane had looked, and she had not been able to look away since. 6 months after Earth formally joined the Galactic Alliance, a routine trade inspection turned into the event that changed everything. It began simply enough. Alliance regulations required that any new member species allow a joint engineering team to inspect their shipyards before full trade routes could open. This was standard practice, meant to make sure fuel types, docking systems, and safety protocols were compatible across the Alliance's many different worlds. No one expected the inspection to reveal anything dramatic. Most new members had small, simple shipyards, a few docks capable of building cargo haulers and short-range patrol craft. The paperwork was usually finished within a week. The team assigned to Earth's inspection was led by a Suan engineer named Ket Ora, a being who looked, to human eyes, like a small cloud of shifting blue light held together by a thin membrane. The Suan were one of the oldest member species in the Alliance, quiet and precise, more interested in machinery than politics. Ket had done over 300 shipyard inspections across a dozen different species. Nothing, they assumed, would surprise them anymore. Ambassador Maya Illich accompanied the inspection team personally, along with a young human engineer named David Okafor, who worked directly under Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes, the officer in charge of Sol Systems' defense fleet. Threll Vane requested to attend as well, citing her role as the original contact ambassador, and after some hesitation from the human side, permission was granted. They traveled first to the shipyards near Earth's moon, where cargo vessels and passenger ships were built. It was, as expected, unremarkable. Clean facilities, efficient workers, standard technology slightly behind Alliance norms in some areas, and slightly ahead in others. Ket took notes, nodded politely, and prepared to file a routine report. Then Maya said something that made the entire inspection take an unexpected turn. "This isn't where our defense fleet gets built," she said, almost as an afterthought, as they walked along an observation deck overlooking the lunar yards. "If you want to properly certify compatibility, you'll need to see the Neptune yards as well." Ket's light shifted color slightly, a soon expression of mild curiosity. "There are additional yards? Further out?" "Much further out," Maya said. "We built them there for a reason. Distance, mostly, and privacy." The trip to Neptune took 2 days aboard a fast Alliance shuttle, accompanied by a human escort ship that stayed close the entire way. As they approached, Threll noticed the same pattern she had seen during her first arrival months earlier. Patrol ships, spread out in careful formations, watching every angle of approach. But here, near Neptune, the patrols were thicker, more numerous, arranged with a discipline that suggested this place mattered more than anywhere else in the system. What came into view as they closed on the outer planet took Ket Ora, David Okafor, and Threll Vane several long minutes to properly process. It was not a shipyard. It was dozens of shipyards, strung together in a vast ring around Neptune and its moons, connected by long docking arms and supply lines that stretched for thousands of kilometers. And docked within those yards, some finished, some still under construction, some clearly mothballed and powered down but ready to be reactivated, sat ships unlike anything Ket had ever inspected before. They were enormous. Larger than most Alliance capital ships by a wide margin, their hulls built from thick layered plating that Ket's scanners identified as some kind of advanced composite, dense enough to resist weapons far beyond what a young species should have developed on its own. Their designs were brutal and efficient, none of the smooth curves the Alliance preferred, every surface built for function rather than appearance. Weapon emplacements covered them in numbers that made Ket's sensor readouts flicker, with warnings that their systems were not designed to interpret ships this heavily armed. "How many?" Ket asked quietly, their light dimming slightly, "are docked here?" David Okafor checked a datapad, his expression carefully neutral in the way Threll had come to recognize among humans trying not to show emotion. "Active fleet reserve at Neptune yards currently sits at 412 capital ships," he said. "Another 190 are in various stages of construction, or refit." Threll felt something cold settle in her chest. 400 capital ships. The entire combined Alliance fleet, gathered from every member world across the galaxy, numbered perhaps 600 vessels of comparable size. Humanity, a species that had been part of the Alliance for less than a year, possessed nearly as many warships sitting quietly in reserve around a single outer planet. "This is..." Ket's translator struggled for a moment, searching for the right word. "This is not a defense fleet. This is a war fleet." "Yes," Maya said simply. "It is." "May I ask," Threll said carefully, "what war you built it for?" Maya was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the ships through the viewport, their dark hulls catching faint light from the distant sun. "I think it's time you saw the archives," she said finally. "All of you. I've spoken with the Human Assembly. They agree it's time the Alliance understood what happened here, before this goes any further." The archive facility was located deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a mountain range humans called the Rockies, built into solid stone with defenses that made even the shipyards at Neptune look modest by comparison. Ket, David, and Threll were escorted down through layer after layer of security, each checkpoint manned by soldiers whose eyes carried the particular tiredness of people who had spent a long time standing guard over something they never wanted to forget. At the center of the facility was a large chamber, dimly lit, filled with screens and recording devices, that Maya explained had been gathering testimony, footage, and data for over 80 years. She activated the primary display, and the room filled with images that none of the visitors would ever be able to unsee. It began with footage of Earth as it had been nearly a century earlier. Cities much like the ones the delegation had toured, oceans, forests, ordinary human life, carrying on the way it always had. Then the recordings shifted, showing strange readings, detected by early human observatories, an anomaly in deep space, beyond the orbit of Pluto, that grew larger and stranger by the day. We called them the Scarn, Maya said quietly, as the recordings played. We still don't fully understand what they were, some kind of hive intelligence, spread across countless drone bodies, all connected to something larger we never located. They came through what our scientists believed was a natural rift in space, though we later suspected it might have been something they created deliberately. At first we thought it was a natural phenomenon. Then the drones began landing. The footage that followed was hard to watch. Cities burning. Military forces mobilizing with weapons that looked primitive compared to what Threll had seen at Neptune, desperately trying to hold back waves of dark, insect-like machines that seemed to multiply faster than they could be destroyed. Casualty numbers appeared on screen, climbing into the millions within the first weeks alone. They didn't want our planet, Maya continued, her voice steady despite the images playing before them. Not exactly. We eventually understood they wanted something beneath the surface, some kind of resource our scientists still can't fully explain. But whatever their reason, they were willing to destroy everything on Earth to get it, and they very nearly succeeded. Ket's light had gone almost entirely dim, a Suan reaction to deep distress. How long did this war last? 11 years, Maya said. 11 years of losing ground, losing cities, losing people, before humanity finally found a way to fight back properly. We had to unite every nation on the planet, something that had never happened before. Not completely, not like that. We had to invent entirely new kinds of weapons, entirely new kinds of ships, because nothing we had before the war was strong enough to stand against them. The recordings shifted again, showing the construction of the first true warships, humanity's old boundaries between nations dissolving as resources poured into a single unified effort. Threll watched cities rebuilt into shipyards, watched ordinary people trained as soldiers and engineers within months instead of years, watched a species drag itself, bleeding and exhausted, into a kind of unity it had never managed to achieve in peace. In the final year of the war, Maya said, we managed to push them back. Not defeat them, push them back, through the same rift they had come from, using a fleet we built specifically for that single purpose. We lost over 2 billion people before that day came. 2 billion, out of a population that had been just over 11 billion before the war began. The number hung in the silent chamber like something physical. Ket said nothing. David Okafor, who Threll now realized must have grown up hearing about this war his entire life, stared at the floor, his jaw tight. We don't know if they're truly gone, Maya said quietly. We never received confirmation of their destruction, only that they retreated back through the rift, and it closed behind them. For 80 years, we have kept watch, kept building, kept training, in case they ever find their way back. That is why our fleet exists the way it does, not to threaten the Alliance, not to conquer anyone, simply because we learned, in the worst possible way, what happens to a species that isn't ready when something like the Scarn arrives. Threll thought of her first days in Sol System, the silent patrols, the tired eyes of the soldiers she had passed in every hallway, the careful, guarded way Maya had spoken about her people's history that first night over dinner. It all made a terrible kind of sense now. Why did you not tell the Alliance this immediately? Threll asked. Before accepting membership? Maya turned to face her directly. Because the last time we told a group of outsiders about the Scarn, Ambassador, it was because we needed help, and none came in time. We learned to survive on our own, before we learned to trust anyone else with the truth. Old habits, even good ones, take time to unlearn. Ket's light slowly returned to its normal color, as they processed everything they had seen. This information, they said finally, must be reported to the Alliance Council immediately. Fleet numbers of this scale, kept secret until now, will cause significant concern among member species. We understand that, Maya said, and we're prepared to explain ourselves fully, whenever the Council is ready to listen. But I want to be clear about one thing. She looked between Ket and Threll, her expression calm but firm in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. We are not going to dismantle that fleet. Not now, not ever, unless we receive absolute proof that the Skarn are gone for good. If that makes some members of your alliance uncomfortable, I understand. But we already paid the price of being unprepared once. We will not pay it again. The three visitors returned to Alliance space 3 days later, carrying with them recordings, data files, and reports that would soon spread through every level of Alliance government, sparking debates, fear, and fascination in equal measure. Ket Ora's official report, submitted within hours of their return, contained a single line that would be quoted endlessly in the weeks that followed. The human species did not build for war against us, Ket wrote. They built for a war none of us have ever heard of, against an enemy none of us have ever faced, and there is no way yet to know for certain whether that war is truly finished. In the quiet halls of the Alliance High Assembly, that single sentence began to spread like fire through dry grass, and the peaceful, comfortable galaxy that had known 200 years without a real war suddenly found itself looking nervously toward the stars, wondering what exactly it had just invited into its ranks. Threll Vane, meanwhile, found herself thinking less about fear and more about the tired eyes of every human soldier she had met. The 2 billion lives lost before humanity ever learned to build the fleet that now sat quietly around Neptune, and the terrible patience it must have taken to keep watching, keep building, keep waiting for 80 long years for an enemy that might never return. She did not yet know that somewhere far beyond the edges of Alliance space, that patience was about to be tested once more. The report from Ket Ora reached the Alliance High Assembly within 2 days, and by the end of the first week, it had already been read, debated, and argued over by every government among the Alliance's member worlds. What should have been a quiet diplomatic matter had become something closer to a crisis. The Assembly Chamber, usually a place of slow, careful debate, turned loud and chaotic in a way none of the older delegates could remember. Species that had barely spoken to each other in decades suddenly found common cause, either in fear of what humanity represented, or in fascination at what humanity might offer. General Doskar Vel of the Korath was among the first to speak, rising from his seat with the kind of energy that made younger delegates nervous. 400 capital ships, he said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber without need of amplification. Hidden, kept secret from us during their entire application process. And now, we learn this fleet was built to fight something none of us have ever encountered, an enemy capable of costing them 2 billion lives in a single decade. I asked the Assembly plainly, did we invite a new member into our ranks, or did we invite a war we know nothing about? Ambassador Threll Vane, standing near the front of the chamber where she had been called to give her first-hand account, felt the weight of every eye turned toward her. General Vel raises a fair concern, she said carefully, but I would remind this assembly that humanity did not hide this information out of malice. They hid it out of caution, born from bitter experience. When I visited their archive facility, I did not see a species eager for conflict. I saw a species still grieving losses most of us cannot imagine. Grief does not disarm 400 warships, Doskar replied. No, Threll agreed. But fear should not blind us to what those warships might mean for our safety, should the enemy they built them against ever return. That single exchange set the tone for months of debate that followed. The alliance split, slowly but clearly, into factions that argued over what to do about their newest and most unsettling member. Some, led largely by older, more cautious species like the Velmari, and the gentle, methodical Soon, argued that humanity's fleet, whatever its origins, represented an opportunity. The alliance had grown comfortable during its long peace, its own military forces reduced over generations of budget cuts and complacency. A species that had already fought and survived something the alliance had never faced could serve as a valuable shield, a source of hard-won knowledge about surviving true existential threats. Others, led by voices like General Doskar Vel and a growing number of frightened smaller worlds, argued the opposite. A species capable of building and hiding a fleet that large could not be trusted. What if humanity had exaggerated their history to justify keeping such power? What if the story of the Skarn was true, but humanity's true intentions toward the Alliance were not as peaceful as they claimed? What if, having built weapons strong enough to fight off an ancient terror, humanity decided the Alliance itself made an easier target? Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes was summoned to appear before the Assembly personally, the first time a human military officer had ever stood in that chamber. He arrived in a simple dress uniform, no medals on display, his expression calm in the particular way of someone who had faced far worse rooms than this one. "I understand your concerns," he said, once given the floor. "If I were in your position, hearing what you've heard, I would be concerned too. So let me be direct with you, because I think you deserve directness, after we kept our history quiet for so long." He paused, looking slowly across the assembled delegates from 100 different worlds. "Our fleet exists because we learned, at a cost of 2 billion lives, that peace is not something you simply enjoy, it's something you actively protect. We are not interested in conquering the Alliance. We joined because we believe cooperation between free peoples is worth pursuing, and because, frankly, if the Skarn ever do return, we would rather face them alongside allies than alone. But I will not stand here and promise you that we will dismantle the only thing standing between our people and extinction, just to make anyone in this room feel more comfortable. That ship, so to speak, has already sailed." His words did little to calm the fear in the room, though they did earn him a grudging respect from several of the more military-minded delegates, including, oddly enough, General Doscarvel himself, who found himself admiring the man's blunt honesty, even as he distrusted its implications. Over the following months, Alliance intelligence agencies quietly began their own investigations, eager to verify humanity's story independently, rather than rely solely on human testimony. Old star charts were pulled from archives. Ancient trade routes near the region, humanity called the Rift, were examined for any hint of unusual activity. Slowly, carefully, evidence began to surface that made even the most skeptical delegates uneasy. A Velmari research vessel, cross-referencing decades-old survey data, discovered records of strange gravitational disturbances in a sector of space bordering human territory, dated roughly to the same period as humanity's war. The disturbances had been dismissed at the time as sensor error, an easy mistake given how far the readings had been from any inhabited Alliance world. Now, viewed alongside human records, they lined up almost perfectly with the timeline of the Skarn's arrival and eventual retreat. A soon historical archive, digging through old trade logs from a minor mining colony near the edge of Alliance space, found records of several supply ships that had vanished without explanation during roughly the same period, their disappearance attributed at the time to pirates or navigational accidents. No wreckage had ever been found. No distress signals had ever been received. They had simply stopped reporting in, one after another, over the course of several months, before the disappearances abruptly ceased. None of it was definitive proof. But piece by piece, the evidence painted a picture that matched humanity's story closely enough to quiet many of the loudest doubters, even as it raised a new and more troubling question. If the Skarn's territory bordered human space during the war, and if their retreat had simply pushed them back through some kind of rift, rather than destroying them outright, where exactly had they gone? And more importantly, was there any way to know for certain whether they were still out there, waiting? It was this question that occupied Ambassador Threll Vane during the long nights of debate and investigation that followed. She had been assigned, somewhat reluctantly, to head a joint Alliance Human Commission, tasked with studying the old Rift region more closely, using combined resources from several Alliance member worlds alongside human survey ships. The work was slow and often frustrating. The Rift itself, according to human data, had closed decades earlier, leaving behind only faint traces detectable by the most sensitive instruments. But faint traces were still traces, and over several months of careful surveying, the Commission began to notice something troubling. The readings, once thought stable and fading, had begun to shift, slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. Whatever remained of the old Rift was beginning to change in ways that matched, almost exactly, the early readings recorded by human scientists 80 years earlier, just before the Skarn's first arrival. Threll brought the findings personally to Fleet Admiral Reyes, who reviewed them in silence for a long time before finally speaking. "How confident are your scientists in this data?" he asked. "Confident enough that I felt it necessary to inform you immediately, rather than wait for a full Alliance review," Threll said. "Admiral, if this pattern continues to match your historical records, we may be looking at early signs of the rift reopening, possibly within the next several months." Marcus Reyes was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular calm of a man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment, hoping it would never come. "Then it's time we stopped debating what to do with our fleet," he said, and started preparing to use it. Word of the Commission's findings spread through the Alliance quickly, and the tone of the ongoing debate shifted overnight. Fear of humanity's power was slowly replaced by a deeper, more immediate fear, one that had nothing to do with humans at all. If the ancient enemy that had nearly destroyed an entire species was truly on the verge of returning, the question was no longer whether humanity could be trusted. It was whether the Alliance itself was ready for what was coming. General Doskar Vel, once among the loudest voices calling for humanity's fleet to be restricted or dismantled, found himself instead standing before the assembly, arguing the opposite position, his pride giving way to plain practicality. "We spent months arguing over whether to trust the humans with their own weapons," he said. "I suggest we spend the coming months learning from them instead, before we discover the hard way exactly what kind of enemy convinced a peaceful species to build a fleet capable of matching our own 6 times over." The assembly, shaken and uncertain, voted to formally request Sol Systems' full cooperation in preparing Alliance defenses along the border regions closest to the old rift. It was, in many ways, exactly what Fleet Admiral Reyes and the human assembly had hoped for, since the day they first accepted their invitation into the Alliance. Not conquest, not domination, simply the chance to stand beside allies, at last, instead of facing an old and terrible enemy entirely alone. None of them yet knew exactly when the rift would fully reopen, or in what strength the Skarn might return. But as ships from a dozen different Alliance worlds began moving toward the border in slow, careful coordination with human fleet commanders, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The peace the galaxy had known for 200 years was ending, whether anyone was ready for it or not. And the species the Alliance had once dismissed as young, primitive, and harmless was about to prove, in the most terrible way possible, exactly why it had built the largest war fleet in known space. The rift reopened, on a day that would later be marked on calendars across a dozen different worlds, remembered by a dozen different names, in a dozen different languages, but known to history simply as the Return. It happened first at a small mining colony called Perth Station, a modest outpost built by a joint Velmari-Korath company near the border region the Commission had been monitoring for months. The colony's sensors picked up the disturbance less than an hour before the first drones arrived, barely enough time to send a warning before the attack began in full. They came the way human records had described, dark shapes pouring out of a tier in space that had not been there the day before, moving with a coordinated, almost insect-like efficiency that made them terrifyingly difficult to fight. Perth Station's small defense force, 3 patrol ships, and a handful of point defense platforms lasted less than 20 minutes before the colony's automated distress beacon went silent. The signal reached Alliance Fleet Command and Sol System Command at nearly the same moment, thanks to the joint monitoring network established during the months of preparation. For the first time in the Alliance's long history, human and Alliance officers found themselves staring at the same emergency alert, in the same command network, forced to make the same terrible decision within minutes of each other. Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes did not hesitate. He had been waiting for this moment for the better part of his career, training for it since he was young enough to still believe, foolishly, that it might never come. "Activate Neptune Reserve Fleet," he said, his voice steady over the command channel that connected Earth to every Alliance command post along the border. "All ships, full readiness. This is not a drill." Within the hour, ships that had sat quiet and mothballed for decades began waking up across the yards at Neptune, their reactors coming online in sequence, their crews, many of whom had trained for this exact scenario their entire adult lives without ever expecting to actually fight, moving into position with a discipline that surprised even the Alliance officers watching the deployment feeds in real time. At the same moment, Alliance ships from a dozen member worlds began moving toward the border as well, though with considerably less confidence. Many of their crews had never fired a weapon at anything other than a training target. 200 years of peace had left the Alliance's military forces skilled at ceremony and patrol duty, but almost entirely unprepared for a real, sustained fight against an enemy that did not negotiate, did not retreat easily, and did not seem to fear death in any way a normal species would recognize. General Doscarvel, commanding the largest Korath contingent responding to the crisis, found himself in an uncomfortable position as his ships approached the border region alongside the first wave of human reinforcements. His crews were brave, disciplined in the old Korath tradition, but they had never seen anything like what greeted them on their sensors as they approached what remained of Perth Station. The drones had not stopped at the colony. They had begun spreading outward in expanding waves, their numbers seemingly endless, consuming everything in their path with the same terrible efficiency the human archives had described 80 years earlier. Ships, stations, even small unmanned mining platforms were stripped down to raw material within hours, the drones somehow converting whatever they destroyed into more of themselves. By the ancestors, Doskar muttered, watching the tactical display aboard his flagship. The old records didn't do justice to this. A voice came through on the Joint Command channel, calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. It was Fleet Admiral Reyes, arriving with the lead elements of the Neptune Reserve Fleet, his ships moving into formation with the same eerie precision Threl Vane had first noticed nearly 2 years earlier, when the gentle current had first entered Sol system. General Vel, this is Reyes. We've fought this enemy before. Your ships haven't. I recommend you hold your formation behind our lead elements and follow our lead on tactics. We've learned some hard lessons about how they fight. Doskar, proud as any Korath commander, might once have refused such an order out of simple pride, but watching the drones consume an entire mining platform in less time than it took to finish the thought, he found humility came more easily than expected. Understood, Admiral, he said. Lead the way. What followed became known, in the years afterward, as the Battle of the Border. Though it was really a series of smaller engagements, stretched across several days, fought along a rapidly shifting front, as the Skarn swarm pushed outward from the reopened rift in every direction at once. Human tactics, developed at terrible cost over 11 brutal years of war, 8 decades earlier, proved decisive, in ways that stunned Alliance commanders, watching the engagement unfold. Where Alliance ships instinctively tried to hold defensive lines, spreading their firepower evenly across incoming threats the way training manuals suggested, human ships moved in tight, coordinated groups, concentrating overwhelming force against small sections of the swarm at a time, opening gaps that Allied ships could then exploit. Where Alliance point defense systems struggled to track the sheer number of small, fast-moving drones, human ships deployed something the Alliance had never seen before. Clouds of small automated interceptors, cheap and expendable, designed specifically to overwhelm swarm tactics with sheer numbers of their own. It was, Threl Vane would later reflect, a kind of grim mirror to the enemy they fought, humanity having learned long ago that fighting a swarm sometimes required becoming one yourself. Aboard the human flagship. Resolute. The same vessel that had first intercepted the gentle current. Nearly 2 years earlier, Fleet Admiral Reyes coordinated the defense with a calm that belied the exhaustion visible on every face around him. His crew had trained for this their entire careers, running endless simulations, studying every scrap of data from the original war, praying it would never be needed. Now, faced with the real thing, decades of preparation paid off, in ways that saved thousands of lives across the border region. Threl Vane, who had insisted on accompanying the fleet as an official Alliance observer, despite objections from several nervous colleagues, watched the battle unfold from a secure position aboard an Alliance command ship, several systems back from the front line. She watched human and Alliance crews fighting side by side for the first time in history, watched old fears and suspicions burn away in the face of a shared, terrible threat, watched something that might, in time, become real trust begin to form between species that had barely known each other a year earlier. It was not an easy victory. Losses on both sides were heavy. Perth Station and 2 smaller Alliance colonies were lost entirely before the swarm's advance could be contained. their populations either evacuated in time or lost along with the stations themselves. Several human ships, including two of the newer Neptune-built cruisers, were destroyed in the fighting, their crews giving their lives to buy time for Allied evacuation efforts that would otherwise have failed. But slowly, over the course of 5 brutal days, the combined fleet began to turn the tide. Human tactics, alliance numbers, and a growing, hard-won cooperation between crews who had started the week as strangers and ended it as something closer to comrades, gradually pushed the Skarn swarm back toward the rift from which it had emerged. On the 6th day, Fleet Admiral Reyes made a decision that would later be remembered as one of the defining moments of the entire conflict. Rather than simply holding the line and waiting for the swarm's advance to stall on its own, he proposed a bold, dangerous plan, one drawn directly from lessons learned during humanity's original war against the Skarn 80 years earlier. "We pushed them back through the rift," he told the assembled command staff, both human and alliance, gathered aboard the Resolute, for what had become known simply as the War Council. "And this time, we don't let it close behind them quietly. We seed it with everything we've got. If there's any chance of collapsing that rift permanently, or at least damaging whatever keeps it open, this is our best opportunity to try." It was a plan that carried enormous risk. It required human and alliance ships to advance directly into the heart of the swarm's remaining strength, close enough to the rift itself to deploy specialized ordnance that human scientists had spent decades developing, but never had the chance to properly test in real combat. If it failed, the combined fleet risked losing enough ships to leave the entire border region defenseless against whatever came through the rift next. General Doskar Vel, who had grown to respect Fleet Admiral Reyes considerably over the preceding days of brutal fighting, was the first Alliance commander to voice his support. "We've spent 2 centuries forgetting what it costs to keep peace," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a warrior who had watched too many of his own crew die over the previous days to pretend the stakes were anything less than they truly were. The humans remembered it the hard way, so the rest of us wouldn't have to learn it the same way. I say we trust the ones who already paid that price, to know how to finish this properly. The vote among the assembled commanders was not unanimous, but it was decisive enough. Within hours, the combined fleet began its advance toward the rift, moving with the grim, determined discipline of crews who understood, perhaps for the first time in generations for most of the Alliance species present, exactly what it meant to fight for something larger than themselves. As the fleet moved into position, Threlvane found herself standing beside Ambassador Maya Illich aboard the command ship, both women watching the tactical display in silence, as human and Alliance ships alike, prepared for what could easily become the most important battle of the young alliance between their two peoples. "Are you afraid?" Threll asked quietly. Maya considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Every single time," she said. "Fear never really goes away, Ambassador. You just learn to keep moving despite it. That's the only lesson we ever really learned from the Skarn. In the end, everything else was just details." Ahead of them, in the dark space beyond the fleet's forward line, the rift shimmered faintly, an old wound in the fabric of space that had once nearly ended humanity entirely, and now stood as the final barrier between 2 united fleets and whatever peace might come after. The advance began at dawn, ship time, though there was no true sunrise in the void where they fought. Only the steady, determined movement of ships from a dozen different worlds, moving forward together, toward an ending that none of them could yet be certain they would survive to see. The final push toward the rift began in silence. The kind of silence that settles over a battlefield in the moments before everything breaks loose at once. Ships from a dozen worlds moved forward together, human dreadnoughts at the center of the formation, Alliance cruisers spread out along the flanks, all of them advancing toward the shimmering wound in space that had once nearly ended an entire species. Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes stood at the center of the Resolute bridge, watching the tactical display with the calm focus of a man who had spent his whole life training for exactly this moment. Around him, officers moved with quiet efficiency, checking systems, confirming positions, running through the same procedures they had drilled 1,000 times in simulations, never quite believing they would need them for real. "Rift stability holding," reported the ship's sensor officer. "Swarm concentration heaviest along the immediate approach, consistent with historical patterns from the original conflict. Understood, Reyes said. All ships, hold formation. We move as one, or we don't move at all. Beside him, on a secure channel connecting every Allied command ship in the fleet, General Doskar Vel's gravelly voice came through, steady despite the tension in it. Korath forces in position, Admiral. Whenever you give the word. Velmari support fleet standing by, added another voice, calmer and more measured, belonging to a commander whose people had spent the last 200 years believing war was something that happened to other species, in other times. Reyes took a slow breath, glancing briefly at the faces around him, human faces that had grown up hearing stories of the war their grandparents had fought, faces that had trained their entire lives for a moment they had hoped, in some quiet corner of their hearts, might never actually come. All ships, he said, advance. The battle that followed would later be studied by military academies across 100 different worlds, taught for generations, as a turning point, not just in the war against the Skarn, but in the history of the Alliance itself. It began with the swarm surging forward to meet the advancing fleet, drones pouring out in numbers that made even the veteran human crews grip their controls a little tighter, memories of old recordings, and worse stories, flashing briefly through minds that had trained for this exact scenario without ever truly believing it would look this bad in person. Human tactics, refined over decades of preparation and now tested once again in real combat, held the line where Alliance ships alone would have faltered. Coordinated strike groups tore into the edges of the swarm, opening gaps that Allied ships pushed through with growing confidence, learning with every passing minute how to fight an enemy unlike anything most of them had ever faced. Threll Vane watched from the command ship as human and Alliance crews fought side by side, their communication growing steadily smoother as the battle wore on, old suspicion and fear burning away in the shared urgency of survival. She watched Korath gunners taking cues from human tactical officers without hesitation, watched Velmari engineers routing emergency power to Allied ships damaged in the fighting, watched something genuinely new forming in real time between species that, only 2 years earlier, had barely known of each other's existence. The turning point came 4 hours into the engagement, when Fleet Admiral Reyes gave the order that would decide the outcome of the entire battle. Ordnance teams, prepare rift collapse payload, he said. We only get one chance at this. Make it count. Deep within the Resolute. Launch bays, specialized weapons developed over decades of careful research, weapons humanity had hoped never to use, were loaded and prepared for deployment. Designed originally by scientists who had studied the rift's strange properties for years after the original war, the payload was meant to do something no conventional weapon could accomplish. Rather than simply destroying the drones pouring through the rift, it was built to disrupt whatever unknown mechanism kept the tear in space stable, collapsing it from within. It required getting dangerously close, closer than any sane commander would normally risk bringing a fleet, directly into the heart of the swarm's remaining concentration near the rift itself. It was, by any reasonable measure, an enormously risky gamble. Human forces, converge on my position, Reyes ordered. Alliance ships, cover our flanks and keep their numbers off our backs. This is it. What followed was the most intense fighting of the entire battle, a desperate, close-range struggle, as human ships pushed forward through the thickest concentration of drones, escorted by Alliance vessels, fighting harder than most of their crews had ever fought in their lives. Losses mounted quickly on both sides. 2 more human cruisers were lost in the final push, their crews buying just enough time for the Resolute and its escort group to reach effective range of the rift itself. Payload away, came the report from the launch bay, tense but steady. The specialized ordnance streaked toward the rift, disappearing into the shimmering tier in space, at the exact moment Fleet Admiral Reyes gave the order for the entire fleet to begin a controlled retreat, pulling back from the rift's immediate vicinity, as fast as their engines could manage. For several long, terrible seconds, nothing happened. Then the rift began to shudder, its edges flickering unstably, the strange energy holding it open beginning to collapse in on itself. Drones caught near the opening seemed to hesitate, some kind of instinct or command structure clearly disrupted by whatever was happening to the space around them. Then, all at once, the rift collapsed entirely, taking with it every drone still within its immediate vicinity, leaving behind only empty, quiet space, where a wound in reality had stood only moments before. The remaining drones scattered across the battlefield, cut off from whatever had been coordinating their assault, faltered and slowed, their movements growing erratic and disorganized. Without the rift feeding new numbers into the fight, the combined fleet made short work of what remained, human and Alliance ships working together to clean up the last pockets of resistance over the following hours. By the time the battlefield finally fell silent, the sun rising, ship time, over a region of space that had nearly become humanity's second graveyard, the war was over. Not finished in the sense of a clean final victory, since no one could be entirely certain the Skarn were truly gone forever, but over in the sense that mattered most immediately. The rift was closed, the immediate threat repelled, and the border region secured once more, this time by a fleet built from a dozen different worlds fighting as one. The cost had been steep, nearly 40 ships lost across the combined fleet, thousands of lives, human and Alliance alike, given in the fighting. But it could have been far worse, and everyone present understood clearly that without humanity's fleet, without decades of hard-earned preparation born from their own terrible war 80 years earlier, the losses would likely have been catastrophic for the entire Alliance. In the weeks that followed, the mood across Alliance space shifted dramatically. The fear and suspicion that had colored so much of the debate over humanity's hidden fleet gave way, almost overnight, to something closer to gratitude and respect. Ambassador Maya Illich found herself addressing the Alliance High Assembly once more, though this time, the chamber that had once buzzed with fearful debate listened in something closer to reverent silence. "We didn't build our fleet to threaten anyone," she said, her voice steady, carrying easily across a chamber that had finally learned to listen properly. "We built it because we learned, at terrible cost, that peace has to be defended, actively and constantly, by those willing to bear that burden. We hoped, when we joined this alliance, that we might finally share that burden with others, rather than carrying it alone. I believe, after what we've all just been through together, that hope has finally been realized." General Doscarvel, who had once been among the loudest voices calling for humanity's fleet to be restricted, rose to speak immediately after her, his tone entirely different from the suspicious general who had first challenged Threlvane's report months earlier. "I spent months arguing that the humans could not be trusted with the power they had built," he said. "I was wrong. What I failed to understand was that power built from suffering, tempered by hard experience, and offered freely in defense of others, is not a threat. It is a gift, one that few species are willing to make, and fewer still are capable of making well. The Alliance owes humanity a debt we should not soon forget." The Assembly voted, within days, to formally recognize humanity's fleet not as a point of concern requiring restriction, but as a critical component of Alliance-wide defense, with joint training programs established between human and Alliance forces to ensure that the hard lessons of the Skarn War would never again be forgotten by a galaxy that had grown too comfortable in its long peace. Ambassador Threlvane, whose careful first report had started this entire chain of events nearly 2 years earlier, found herself invited to a quiet dinner aboard the Resolute, hosted by Fleet Admiral Reyes and Ambassador Illich, along with General Doscarvel and several other officers who had fought together during the final battle at the Rift. "You were the first one who noticed something was different about us," Maya said, raising a glass in Threll's direction, before anyone else even suspected. "I simply asked questions others were too polite, or too eager to ask," Threll replied, her antennae twitching in what had become, over her long assignment among humans, a small gesture of genuine affection. "I am glad, in the end, that the answers led here, rather than somewhere far worse." Fleet Admiral Reyes raised his own glass, looking around at the small gathering of officers and diplomats from species that had barely known of each other's existence a few short years earlier, now bound together by shared loss and shared victory in equal measure. "To old wars finally shared," he said, "and to whatever comes next, faced together instead of alone." The toast was met with quiet agreement from everyone at the table, human and Alliance alike, each of them carrying their own private thoughts about the battle behind them and the uncertain peace ahead. Somewhere far beyond the closed rift, in regions of space still uncharted by either human or Alliance scouts, the true fate of the Skarn remained unknown, a question that would likely take generations to answer fully. But for the first time in its long history, the Galactic Alliance no longer faced that uncertainty alone. It faced it standing beside a species that had already paid the terrible price of learning, the hard way, exactly what it took to survive against an enemy from beyond the stars, and had chosen, in the end, to share that hard-won knowledge, rather than hoard it in fearful isolation. The war that had built humanity's fleet was, perhaps, not truly finished. But the peace that fleet now helped protect had grown stronger, and wider, and more resilient than anyone in the Alliance could have imagined, on the day a small diplomatic ship first approached a quiet, watchful world on the edge of known space, expecting to find nothing more than a young, harmless civilization, waiting to be welcomed among the stars. They had found something far greater instead, not a threat, and not merely an ally, but a species that understood, better than any other in the galaxy, exactly what it meant to stand and fight so that others might never have to learn the same terrible lessons alone. And in the quiet space where the rift had once stood, the stars shone on, steady and unbroken, watched over now by a fleet built from many worlds, ready together for whatever the dark might bring next.